of Science and Technology. Before moving to Canada, he worked as a health promoter in several reception centers for refugees in Italy and as a headhunter for a Dutch multinational firm. His dissertation, which is entitled The Certification of Insanity, Local Origins and Global Consequences, explores the emergence of the medical certification of insanity in the 19th century. Taking a transnational approach, he looks at the influence of the British system of certification around the world. His research engages with some of the most delicate issues in contemporary health policy, including stigma, expertise, and human rights. And he collaborates with the WHO's, not the band, but the World Health Organization, mental health unit on the Mind Bank project. He's passionate about digital humanities. He created Mind the Past, a web site dedicated to health and disability rights in history, and in his free time, Filippo enjoys Delta blues and trail running. I love when people add those little things, like me and my martini, and Amelia and her kickboxing, things like that. The talk today is From Persons to Cases: The Global History of Lunacy Certificates, 1850s to the 1890s. Filippo, the floor is yours.
Professor Davidson, thank you so much for giving us this opportunity. It is fantastic to be here. It is fantastic to see everyone. Thanks, Amelia, again, for organizing this wonderful event. Let me share my screen just very quickly so we can get started. And so the topic of my talk today will be basically focused on the broader theme of my dissertation project, which is still an ongoing project, as you can imagine. So I'm really looking forward to your comments and your thoughts, and I really welcome your input. I believe this is a relatively niche topic. We're going to be talking about the history of psychiatry, the history of confinement, institutions for the insane, and so on. And I'm aware that I cannot make so many assumptions about what the general audience might know about this topic. So I want to get started with just a general overview of the history of madness and the history of psychiatry. So I'm having an issue here with my screen. It doesn't seem to be working. Amelia, perhaps you can help me. I don't know.
Filippo, if you try.
Oh, yes, it works. It works. Okay. Fantastic. Okay, great. That's fantastic. Yes, so I just want to get started with just a very short overview of the history of madness, especially in the modern period. So the last 200, 300 years. I know this is very tentative. This is just very broad, and it can be criticized in many different ways, but just to give us an idea, okay, of what we're going to talk about. And the historical responses to a phenomena of psychosocial disabilities, what at the time it used to be referred to as lunacy or insanity or mental derangement or soundness of mind, as far as largely and greatly, of course, different jurisdictions, different countries, different cultural traditions. And in Western Europe, mostly we can divide the history of psychiatry into three eras, broadly speaking. So until the 1830s, we can say that historical responses to lunacy and mental issues were variegated. Okay, there were many. Insanity was a contested area amongst the religious traditions, cultural traditions, and mainly we can say that there was no large-scale institutional framework for responding to problems related to psychosocial disabilities. Things started to change during the 1830s, from the 1830s to the 1970s, and this is the period we're going to be talking about, a period which is usually recognized in the history of madness as the institutional era of psychiatry, okay, when a period in which the asylum, lunatic asylums, institutions for the insane became the elective and state-sponsored strategy for dealing with mental health problems. And then starting from the 1970s onward, very gradually, in different ways, in different countries, we entered into a new period, which can be defined as community-based treatment, basically understanding mental health problems with the help of classification systems like DSM, psychopharmacology. I'm not assuming any sort of progress here, okay? So it's there are problems now, there were problems back then, So I'm just using this framework for us, okay, and for the purpose of this presentation. And we're entering, therefore, into the period of asylum care, okay? And let's start to talk about the institutional era of psychiatry, okay? So relatively speaking, from the 1830s to the 1970s, what was going on, why the asylum, what was a lunatic asylum, and how could people be confined, which is really the real focus of today's talk, okay? So starting in the 1820s in Central Europe and North America, many politicians, doctors, reformers started to buy into several assumptions about insanity, okay? That insanity was a disease of the human frame, to use the language of the time, a disease that could be understood from a medical perspective, anatomically and physiologically later, and it was a brain disease, okay? From the 1870s onwards, it was understood largely as a brain disease, okay? This kind of disease required a specific knowledge, psychological medicine. It required a specific body of experts, understood as alienists at the beginning and also psychiatrists. So this is why we trace the history of psychiatry to this institutional period. And insanity required a specific treatment, a moral treatment that could take place in a specific place, PSI, and hence the purpose of this peculiar institution, which was a specialized establishment, usually located outside city centers with green spaces and plenty of fresh air when possible. It wasn't understood as a curative institution, so a place where people went in, but they were also expected to go out as cured or at least relieved. These were institutions that fell under a medical direction with an asylum superintendent who was usually residing in the institution with his family. At the time, it was mainly men superintendents, okay? And these institutions were the location for the pursuit of moral treatment, okay? Which started from the assumption that the alienated could be cured if removed quickly to the asylum. They can be cured with kindness, with order, and with classification. So basically distinguishing between different categories of insanities and lunacy. There was absolutely no requirement for physical restraints, or at least this is what they were trying to advocate for. Occupation, so manual labor, was an important requisite of moral treatment in many jurisdictions, especially in France and in common law jurisdictions. Amusements was also an important part of the institutional era of psychiatry, with patients participating in balls, in music balls, but also giving them the chance to read books and newspapers. This was also a curative institution, so this was the place where therapeutics took place, such as baths, diet, specific diet, substances such as opium, laudanum, and also later on, by the 20th century, also extreme methods such as insulin coma therapy and others. Now, something I want to emphasize is that lunatic asylums did not operate in a vacuum. These were institutions regulated by law. There were specific statutes, okay, directing who was to take part of the moral treatment, how could people be confined, what were the conditions for discharging patients, and the several offices related to the superintendency of the asylum. An important notion is that starting in the 1840s, specifically in Europe, but also in North America and in Australia, the state started to understand sort of a new responsibility, to take on a new responsibility regarding the insane poor. This emphasis on public assistance can be also seen in many legislative actions, such as in France, which was one of the first jurisdictions in which lunatic asylums, public lunatic asylums, became mandatory, okay, for every department of France, starting in 1938, and following the same trajectory, also England and Wales, after 1845, county lunatic asylums became a mandatory presence in every county and borough in the island. So by the turn of the 20th century, especially the interwar period, lunatic asylums populated different jurisdictions around the world, but the phenomenon of confinement was not a uniform one. The same numbers of admissions that we see in Western Europe and in North America, we don't see them as high in colonial jurisdictions such as in Africa or in the Pacific and in India. Now we're turning towards the central topic of today's talk, which is the certification of insanity, which was a procedure for regulating confinement. So we're talking about how people got into the institutions. And we're going to place certification of insanity in a global perspective. We're going to see how lunacy certificates and the provisions for certification traveled around the world in the second half of the 19th century. I want to emphasize how certification transformed persons, so personal problems, into cases, into quantifiable cases. And we will also provide a sketch of the legacy of lunacy certificates in today's mental health documents, especially in Canada. I want to contribute to the broader literature on the social history of madness and specifically related to the legal procedures for determining lunacy in everyday life, which was basically certification of insanity was a decision-making process which happened outside institutions, which was regulated by law, but it also involved practitioners. And I also want to underline the important relationship, historical relationship between quantification and policymaking. So let's start with the 19th century and the confinement legislation developed in the 19th century. And I want to say how I believe that this is an important source. These are important sources for understanding the history of psychiatry, especially in the institutional period. Of course, confinement legislation cannot tell us a lot about the experience of being certified or being inside an institution, but confinement laws can tell us a great deal about the medico-legal assessment of lunacy. So in particular, who should be who should be in charge of making the decision of declaring a person insane? For instance, should there be a sheriff, a judge, a justice of the peace, a medical practitioner, one medical practitioner, two or three? What are the key features that define lunacy? For instance, is it necessary that a person shows violence or delusions for granting confinement? And most importantly, and I believe it is an important piece to emphasize, how to examine, how to perform the examination. Should the examination take place in public, in an open court, in a trial, before a jury, or should it take place in a form of personal interaction between the physician and the patient with witnesses? So these are some of the problems that confinement legislation during the 19th century tried to address, and specifically certificates of insanity provided a solution for this delicate decision-making process. Particularly, the different jurisdictions emphasized and provided and advanced different solutions for confining patients, but the one I want to focus on today, and I believe, and I want to show that it was extremely influential for many parts of the world, including Canada, was the British system. The British system was developed between 1828 and 1853, and it required standardized templates. Okay, so there were specific statutes outlining standardized templates for performing a certification of insanity. It required 2 practitioners for certifying patients. Each practitioner had to personally and separately examine the patient, and he or she had to indicate facts of insanity, so written proof of insanity, distinguishing between facts of insanity personally observed and facts of insanity communicated by others. These documents were mandatory for all institutions in Britain, which means that patients can only be admitted into a lunatic asylum if certified. And another important feature is that these certificates were indefinite, meaning that once certified, always certified. Only a discharge document could cancel a certificate of insanity, okay? And here we see an example of how a certificate of insanity could have looked like. We see in the case of Dr. Harris, who personally and separately examined the patient, Edward F. George, in Greenwich in 1903, and we see how Dr. Harris indicated that the patient is deluded, that he has pictures, he claims that he had pictures worth thousands of pounds, which was not a fact, and he was involved in painting portraits of the royalties of Europe, and he was exhibiting restless manner and incoherent speech. And he also, Dr. Harris also reported that Alfred George, the patient's brother, concurred in this idea that Harris had, that the patient had exalted ideas regarding his wealth, that he was squandering his money, and that he wonders aimlessly about the streets at night. Now, I want to emphasize that, as surprising as it might seem, this was a legal document which granted confinement, perpetual confinement theoretically, into an institution, and that it was also a legal document that could be used by patients in a court of law for suing practitioners if they believed that they were improperly confined and improperly declared insane. Okay, so these were very important documents. And now, let me make sure. Okay, now, since in 1857, we can see how this certification system could only be found in England, Wales, and Scotland. But several decades later, it really became a global system. We can see from the map that it replicated, broadly speaking, the British Empire in the interwar period, and that physicians and doctors in different parts of the world, really from the Fiji Islands to British Columbia, from Cape Colony to Edinburgh, from Jamaica to Hong Kong, learned how important it was to indicate facts of insanity, which was a challenging task for all practitioners involved. And we see that some jurisdictions usually understood to be part of the British Empire, such as Ireland, did not embrace this system of certification, but many states of the Union, especially in the East Coast, adopted it. For instance, New York, Pennsylvania, Vermont, Rhode Island, Delaware, and others. So thousands and thousands of patients got confined using the British system of certification, which emphasized doctors' impartiality, facts of insanity, and personal examination. Ontario, of course, was part of this history. It adopted the British system in 1973, which was a sort of a hybrid system. It required 3 doctors instead of 2, and also the signature of 2 witnesses per certificate. And from a comparative perspective, it was a sort of a unique case because it could involve as many as 9 people for certifying 1 patient. So it required a sort of broad consensus for getting 1 patient into a lunatic asylum in Ontario during the 1870s. So we said that these certificates sanctioned the deprivation of liberty of patients throughout the institutional period of psychiatry. They provided an examination framework for practitioners. They required written evidence, okay? So doctors had to write down what they believed to be signs of derangement. And now I want to add something more. I want to emphasize how lunacy certificates created the conditions for seeing and numbering individuals suffering from psychosocial disabilities. And we will see how this might work. Suppose that we are in the 1870s in Ontario and we have a person experiencing some mental problems. The family members, they understand that they cannot deal with the person anymore, and they ask for a certification. They want to get the person confined. So the first step is to get the person confined. And in the 1870s in Ontario, this meant 3 practitioners filling out certificates of insanity, personal examination, and facts of insanity. Once certified, the person could be received into an institution. The clerk of the institution filled out the internal registers, reporting the certificates of insanity and storing the files. And once they filled out the general registers, every year they transmit the records to inspectors. And in the case of Ontario, this central body was the inspectors of prison, asylums, and public charities, which was a sort of provincial entity tasked with supervising all institutions in Ontario during the 1870s and 1880s. Inspectors filled out a report every year, including statistics. So how many people got confined, how many people got discharged. This was the starting point for building trends and for quantifying how many people were were confined in a given institution. And we see how certification was really the starting point for turning persons into cases. It was the starting point for quantification, for transforming individual problems, family concerns into statistics. And some of the numbers, for instance, of the day that really worried reformers and politicians at the time, especially by the turn of the 20th century, we see now some of the numbers in the United States, 250,000 people confined in public institutions. The ratio of people confined in lunatic asylums in Ireland, New South Wales, France, and Germany was 1 every 300 people, which was very high. And also the historical trend was concerning because in England, in ways there were not even 22,000 people confined, that number skyrocketed a few decades later to 120,000. Now, these growing numbers set the conditions again for introducing checks about the rising waves of insanity in a given population. And this is how the history of lunacy certification intersects with the history of eugenics, especially in common law jurisdictions and also in Canada. We see here, for instance, William Hattie, who was a provincial health officer of Nova Scotia from the Canadian Journal of Mental Hygiene, claiming that insanity is becoming more prevalent, it is growing steadily, rapidly, it is really growing larger, and how he understood the importance and he advised for devising some checks to prevent such a disastrous trend. And what kind of checks he had in mind? He had in mind some solutions for preventing the reproduction of young feet. So those parts of the population that they understood to be not successful, not genetically appropriate to succeed in the modern society. And some of these solutions were also embraced in England, in Wales, in Scotland, in New South Wales, in Canada, such as solutions for permanent confinement, immigration bans, so immigration laws, and sterilization acts, which were passed in Canada, for instance, in British Columbia and Alberta in the 1920s. So here we have the main point of today's talk. Certificates set the conditions for quantifying madness. They created concerns about a lunacy epidemic. And this sort of understanding of a lunacy epidemic put things in motion for eugenic advocates who sponsored solutions for limiting the production of persons with psychosocial disabilities, especially in the 1920s and 30s. What happened to lunacy certificates then? We don't see them anymore around. We still use the common expression certifiably insane, but they're not around. Most of them were repealed during the 1960s and 80s with the deinstitutionalization period. The history of lunacy certificates is entangled with the history of lunatic asylums. So once we got rid of lunatic asylums, at least in part, and in some parts of the world, we also got rid of lunacy certificates. But if we look very closely and very carefully into today's mental health legislation around the world, we see how actually they survive in forms of involuntary admission. And this is the case, for instance, in Ontario. Today, doctors, when they fill out the Form 1, so basically an application for psychiatric assessment and for sanctioning involuntary confinement of an individual for not more than 48 hours in Ontario, well, they have to say that they personally examine the patient and that they observe, they indicate written observations personally observed, and facts communicated by others. So they basically, today's physicians, they replicate and they use the same formula which was introduced originally in England in 1853. It arrived in Ontario 20 years later, and it was really a global formula for sanctioning problems related to mental issues. Again, in Prince Edward Island, this is pretty much the same, a personal examination completed by a psychiatrist. Again, distinction between psychiatrist's own observations and doctor sources related to information provided by others. Nova Scotia, again. So we see how in the certificates of insanity are not around us, are not really present in mental health lunacy, in mental health legislation today, but they are somewhat influencing and shaping forms for involuntary treatment. What I've tried today, so I tried to show, or at least illustrate how certificates of insanity were important documents, and they can be understood from a global perspective, how lunacy certificates transform persons into cases, and they provided set the conditions for quantifying the number of institutionalized patients in the institutional era of psychiatry, and how and their legacy in today's mental health documents that we can see from this, in the case of Ontario, PEI, and Nova Scotia. So I thank you so much for being here and for listening to my talk. Really curious about your thoughts and about your questions. So thank you again.
Great. Thank you very much, Filippo. That was very eye-opening. And yeah, I think for a lot of people, we never really sort of think of that. And like you said, the certifiably insane part of the phrase, right, obviously has a lot bigger history than a lot of us have ever considered. Great. We've got time for some questions or concerns, if anyone has any. I'm happy to just throw something. Filippo, I'm just wondering about, like, the last things you showed us, obviously Ministry of Health, right? So we have that, the state in charge of sort of medical practitioning. Was in your research that you've done, have you found any sort of tension between sort of state health versus sort of the guilds or the medical associations, and that, and that kind of, when they're, sort of tasked with looking after their own procedures and things? And of course, this topic, like, it instantly brought up, Foucault's, book, right, where he starts off, even earlier than you, and talking about absolute power and how, powers of detention were so arbitrary. So maybe if you could just sort of tease out a little bit the nitty gritty there of who had the authority.
Yeah, absolutely. Fantastic question. And well, every student or every scholar who's interested in history of psychiatry has to deal with Foucault at one point or the other, right? So the question is somewhat, I could have expected this.
It's coming. It's like, but it's good. Right. It's good that you don't, because if you brought it up, it would take away the question. So it's always good to leave that low-hanging fruit for someone like me to grab at. It's good.
No, it's a good opportunity really to engage with Foucault, who I believe was eye-opening in many ways. We have to remind ourselves that he was writing this history of madness in the late 1950s, when he was working in Stockholm at the time. So, and there was really not much around related to the institutional history of psychiatry and the critical perspective towards the history of psychiatry. So in many ways, the growing field of history of madness, as separate from the history of psychiatry, from an intellectual history of psychiatry, has a lot to do with Foucault's work. Now, I believe there are some points that Foucault would have liked about my work, and some points that he would have had something to say. I think that Foucault's work really showed us how important it was the issue of social control and the issue of power in psychiatry and psychiatric practices, right? And in the institutional period of psychiatry, this is extremely important. Now, certificates of insanity in some way intersect with his work, in a way that certificates of insanity were part of a legal apparatus for documenting insanity. So for seeing really how many people suffer from insanity in a given population, exposing these cases, bringing them to under the watch of the state and into institutions for taking care of them, which is sort of policy that resembles very much what was going on in the case of poverty in England in the 30s at the time. So this is something that Foucault would have liked. What I'm partially criticizing, and I think here I'm diverging from Foucault's work, is the relationship with the understanding of medical power as something something that practitioners wanted to do, as if they wanted to show that they were the only experts on lunacy, that the medical profession as a whole could claim some sort of expertise related to lunacy. Now, and I want to say that doctors found their task, their privileges really, of signing certificates of insanity, daunting and terrifying challenge. Many of them repeatedly during the 1880s and 1890s refused categorically to sign certificates of insanity because they were worried about legal consequences. Some of them were getting sued. Some of them fell out of patients because patients felt that they were being confined for no reason. And practitioners did not want anything to do. They wanted to renounce really about this task. However profitable it might have seemed, and it might have been for practitioners. This was the case in England, but also in many cases. I was just reading from another story in Adelaide in the 1860s, pretty much the same thing. Practitioners signing papers, people getting confined, patients once discharged suing practitioners, and practitioners having to pay damages. So this is something that Foucault would have seen in a different way, I think.
Great. Hako, and then Jean.
Filippo, thank you very much. I really enjoyed the talk. As someone who's mostly interested in the intellectual history, as you know, I particularly liked how you spelled out the assumptions that were considered as a rationale behind the creation of the asylums in the 1820s. And so I've taken the liberty of taking some screenshots. And so now I'm looking at the assumptions that insanity is a disease, that it requires a specific treatment and so on. So if my understanding is correct, you're making a case that it's the acceptance of these assumptions that was one of the intellectual reasons why asylums were established in the first place. Now that we know that we are getting rid of asylums in most of the world, or at least Western world, it's no longer a case that there are asylums. I was wondering if you could provide more detail as to what happened to these assumptions. Are there, which of those are still accepted, which of those are no longer accepted, or is this not even the right way of thinking about it?
Great question. Yeah, absolutely. I'm really happy that assumptions were helpful in understanding and in getting us on the same page related to this psychiatry. What has changed? Well, I would say just one of those assumptions has changed, which is the one related to a specific place. Now we understand mental health problems as being part of a problem of the community. We don't understand institutional treatment as the elective treatment, something that governments should fund and sponsor as the elective way of dealing with mental health problems. This process took years, it took decades. In some jurisdictions, this is still incomplete. The WHO, I also collaborate with in some projects related to the WHO, and one of these projects related to promoting community-based alternatives in Africa, for instance, helping the transition from institutions to community care. And this is basically what it really has changed with the help of the spread, really, in the popularization of standardized systems for classifying mental health problems like the DSM or the ICD, and psychopharmacology. Psychopharmacology being a sort of substitute for treating mental health problems outside buildings. But all the other assumptions, that is, insanity is a disease that can be understood from a neurological perspective, that it requires a specific body of experts, psychiatrists, that it requires a specific treatment, psychopharmacology or psychotherapy. Those are still there.
Thank you very much, Filippo.
Thank you.
And if I can be so bold as to insist to highlight these parts in the dissertation, what was accepted as great already and then what became rejected, for someone who delves into intellectual history, this will provide the necessary foundation. Thank you so much, and good luck with the dissertation.
I will do that. I will do that.
Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Great.
You.
Thanks, Jakob. Jean, please. You're muted, Jean.
That always happens once in a Zoom call. But no, this is less scholarly than the preceding, but never mind. But as a student of 19th century Britain, my notion of an insane asylum is sort of bedlam, which of course predates these acts, but it was just the most horrible dungeon with chained lunatics raving and so on. And apart from that, in the more Gothic literature, the novels, the villains or the hostile family was always having somebody certified, and they would be thrown into an asylum and could not get out. I don't know. So I'm wondering, I guess, how true this is to life. Were there any large number of unethical doctors who would sign for a fee? And were there private institutions still who were less kind to the insane?
Absolutely. Fantastic question that gives me really the chance to talk about Britain and to talk about what was really going on, especially during the first half or the middle of the 19th century regarding institutions for the insane. Now, it is true. I think there is a history, literary history about wrongful confinement in 19th century Britain. There are some examples. For instance, Charles Reed Hard Cash. Is that an important work of fiction, which was really popular, that was published in 1863, if I'm not mistaken, which really revolves around malicious physicians certifying patients and throwing them into dungeons, really. And it is an important distinction, it was mentioned, between private asylums and public asylums. This is crucial, especially when we're talking about England, especially when we're talking about London in the first half of the 19th century. Private asylums was a very important phenomenon in 19th century, 18th century, and 19th century England, which was basically it was very diffused in London. These were institutions that were directed by, sometimes by physicians, but sometimes by businessmen, really, but by families. And they accepted patients upon a fee. So they were making profits out of the number of patients confined, and it was in their interest to have as many patients as possible for as long as possible. Mm-hmm. So there is some clash here between the issue about profit and the issue about cure. Sure. Operators were in the middle, right? They wanted to have as many patients as possible and accept patients. Certificates of insanity, especially in the 1820s, were a solution for this. Indeed, the idea of having two physicians, not one, two, of having standardized templates and having both doctors performing separate examinations, personal examination, and providing facts of insanity, these were all features that were discussed in Parliament through parliamentary investigations, and ex-asylum patients had an important role in promoting these safeguards, really, for avoiding improper confinements into private med houses. So yes, there is a big story about this. There is also an important background for understanding the evolution of the British system of certification in 19th century England and London specifically.
Great.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Great question.
And this also brings to mind that, the famous sort of movie trope where a visitor to an asylum loses their guest pass and ends up getting, mistakenly incarcerated. I think there was a movie just recently that came out, another one of those sort of along the line. Alexa, please.
Thanks, Filippo, for a really interesting talk. I was curious about the intersection of gender and the body politic in lunacy institutions, and I was curious about the ways in which certification changed over the period of time that you're specifically looking at, and the ways in which, whether it be women or people that had gender identities as women, were either more often or less often potentially certified as insane, and then how that changed over time, especially if you think about kind of life stages and like things like, for example, postpartum, and how better medical understanding about postpartum states and then potentially women entering into those institutions. And I was curious about if you found specific patterns around gender and then control of female bodies.
Yeah, great question again. Gender plays a big part in this story, especially since we're talking about England in this period and the issues related to clandestine committals inside private med houses. So we have to try to get into that perspective, right, into that specific context. And we have certifiers, so doctors, legally qualified doctors, who at the time were middle class British, male, white people certifying patients. Okay, this happened in England, but it also happened in many parts of the world. Okay, so we have a sort of a wide observer certifying different experiences related to insanity. Now, in England, the phenomenon of clandestine committals into private med houses was mostly related to women confined into med houses by husbands who were not accepting the sort of behavior displayed by their wives at the time. And there are many interesting cases related to, especially in court cases, so legal documents and legal decisions, in which justices said that basically husbands could do what they wanted with wives, but at the same time they were not to confine them on the basis of insanity alone. So it was sort of understanding that, yes, there was a sort of like authority, okay, very questionable authority of husbands over wives, but that did not relate to lunatic asylums. Lunatic asylums were a different thing. But yes, gender played a big part in this story, and the story of clandestine committal is really a gendered history in many ways.
Great.
Thanks so much.
Thanks, Alexa. Matthew.
Yes. Hi, Filippo. Great presentation. I have a question. I know most of the American context, so there's like a difference in the British Empire and Canada, just correct me. But late 19th century, you get these criticisms of the asylum because they're not actually curing insanity, right? It's just becoming a big managerial institution that's caring for patients and no one's actually being cured. So I'm wondering if at the time when these criticisms start mounting in like 1860s on, did that impact how insanity was certified? Like, did they change the criteria? Are physicians responding to these criticisms in the response to like, hey, you're not actually curing anything, you're just putting people in an institution and caring for them in that space? Is there like a negotiation there?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, great question, which gives me the chance to add something more. When really like the greatest success in terms, globally speaking, of the British system of certification, we see that in the second half of the 19th century, which was really the period in which the asylum lost traction lost momentum as a solution for curing mental health problems. Now, it really became widespread. It had so much success around the world because it was sponsored as a humane way for making good use of the expert judgment of physicians, underlining that doctors should perform an individual examination, an impartial examination, okay, making good use of their expertise in a way. As lunacy certificates started to travel extensively around the world, now in England and in many other parts of North America, there were institutions and lunatic asylums, like big lunatic asylums confining several hundred patients, were extensively criticized, and you're right in this. And at the same time, lunacy certificates also started to become critical in many ways, because far from being understood as a safeguard for avoiding clandestine committals, as they were conceived in the 1820s in London, now they became stigmatizing procedure. Patients wanted to avoid as much as possible to be certified, because they understood the consequences of that. They understood that these were indefinite documents, that they could be defined in their own community as persons certified as insane, and that there were legal consequences as well. So policymakers started to advance some proposals for bypassing certification. For instance, voluntary treatment, outpatient care, and also trying to build neurological clinics, right? Neurological clinics outside lunatic asylums, in general hospitals, but also under private care of neurologists, did not require certification. And these were becoming widespread, and governments started to allow this. And certification became the extrema ratio, really the last resort for patients suffering from mental health problems. But they survived until the 1960s, really, the 1970s in many ways.
Thanks, Matthew. And that last point about the sort of voluntary thing brings to mind The Magic Mountain, right, by Thomas Mann, and how, you know, these people who go up for treatment and then never want to, it gets to be the point they don't want to leave, right? Great. There's no other questions. Please join me in thanking Filippo for another fantastic talk in our series. That was really, really thoughtful and informative. And allow me to tell you all that we have a couple more events left this semester. The big one for the next week is our Northrop Frye Center lecture by Ursula K. Heise from UCLA. And you've probably received the emails. I encourage you to please register. It's Beyond Apocalypse, Climate Change and Urban Narrative. And then that's on Thursday, March 17th at 4 o'clock. And then on Monday, March 28th at 12 p.m., we have our Northrop Frye Center undergraduate research presentations, which are always fantastic. So I also encourage you to please, if you can, pop by to see those. They'll be short 10-minute presentations by the NFC undergraduate fellows. Thank you all very much for your support over the year up to now. A couple more things, just please come up to the next ones. That'd be really great. And I wish you all a very good afternoon. Thanks again, Filippo. Thank you, Amelia.
Thank you so much, Bob. Thank you so much.
Bye-bye.
Thanks for being here.